Good evening. Thank you for joining. Today is the second reading room of the ASALH Social Justice Initiative, an initiative made possible by a grant from Howard University and the Mellon Just Futures Grant. Before we hear from our speakers, I wanted to give you a few instructions. So first, please use the chat as you've been doing. I see we have people from coast to coast: Chesapeake, Virginia, Silver Spring, Maryland, Los Angeles, New Jersey, Pittsburgh, Miami, South Carolina, Philadelphia. Did I say that already? Texas, Iowa, and on and on. So please continue to give your home location a shout out. If you're a member of an ASALH chapter, thank you. Please put your chapter in, and we'd love to hear more from you. Also, please use the chat throughout the evening in order to converse with each other. We'll be taking questions and answers later on in the program. And so if you have a question, we ask that you put it in the Q&A tab on your Zoom camera, on your Zoom platform. If you put your questions there, we'll see them readily, and our team here will be ready to read them to the panelists in order to receive information and hear how they feel about the questions you've asked. So what I'd like to do now is turn it over to our president, Dr. Marvin Delaney, the president of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Thank you, Marvin.
Good evening and welcome to the second Social Justice Reading Room. I am Marvin Delaney, as you heard. I am a professor emeritus at the University of Texas at Arlington, and of course, president of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. ASALH has always been about history, and ASALH has always also been about social justice. So we're very proud and honored to be able to work with and partner with Howard University to do these social justice reading rooms. I want to thank Howard University for partnering with ASALH, and I also want to thank the Mellon Foundation for sponsoring the social justice workshops and the reading rooms. With that, let me thank Dr. Evelyn Higginbotham, who will moderate this evening's social justice reading room. Thank you, Evelyn.
Thank you, Marvin. It's just wonderful to be here tonight. And I want to welcome everyone to the ASALH Social Justice Reading Room. I am Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, and your guide into this virtual space for exploring important books and articles on social justice. ASALH is proud to host its reading room and this program tonight, as was said, in collaboration with Howard University Social Justice Consortium under the leadership of History Department Chair Dr. Nikki Taylor. The consortium is funded by the Just Futures Grant of the Mellon Foundation. ASALH designed its reading room to be an inviting space for people from all walks of life, not just academics. And our goal is to introduce you to authors whose publications in the form of books as well as articles speak in compelling ways to the continuing struggle for racial equality in America. And I am excited tonight about our conversation, which asks the question, how far have we come? We will be hearing from the authors of two books whose frame of reference is the Kerner Commission report on the causes, events, and aftermaths of the civil disorders of 1967, which was released in March 1968. Many of us in this reading room are old enough to remember the Kerner Commission and its official title, the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders. Now, Otto Kerner, then the governor of Illinois, chaired the commission. And we will hear tonight from Alan Curtis, who is the co-editor with Fred Harris of the book, Healing Our Divided Society, Investing in America 50 years after the Kerner Report, which was published in 2018. We will also hear from Michael Jeffries, whose essay appears in this book. And we will hear from Jelani Cobb, who edited the essential Kerner Commission report. The book titles themselves speak to each other as well as to us. And our authors represent important voices in discussions of social justice. So Alan Curtis. Alan is the president, and I'd like for Alan to come on now, is the president of the Eisenhower Foundation in Washington, D.C. The foundation is the private sector continuation of President Lyndon Johnson's Kerner Commission and the National Violence Commission. Alan served as the executive director of President Jimmy Carter's Urban Policy Group and as urban policy advisor to HUD Secretary Patricia Roberts Harris, the first African-American woman to be appointed a cabinet secretary. With Obama administration Justice Department funding, Dr. Curtis and the Eisenhower Foundation replicated and evaluated the evidence-based quantum opportunities and safe haven youth development models in low-income communities. And he's written and edited many books in addition to Healing Our Divided Society. And that book he co-edited with Fred Harris, and Fred Harris served on the original Kerner Commission when he was the United States Senator from Ohio. And our second speaker is Michael Jeffries. He is the Dean of Academic Affairs, the class of 1949 professor in ethics and professor of American Studies at Wellesley College. I am particularly proud of Michael since he was one of my students in the Harvard PhD program. He is the author of 3 books, Behind the Laughs, Community and Inequality in Comedy, published in 2017, Paint the White House Black, Barack Obama and the Meaning of Race in America, published in 2013, and the book Thug Life, Race, Gender, and the Meaning of Hip Hop, published in 2011. Dr. Jeffries has published extensively in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Guardian, The Boston Globe, and he's been interviewed on television and radio. He is the contributor of a chapter in Healing Our Divided Society. And finally, Jelani Cobb, who is no stranger to ASALH. He is an ASALH Life member and a former member of ASALH's Executive Council. He is the Ira A. Lipman Professor of Journalism at the Columbia School of Journalism. Dr. Cobb is both a trained historian and a professor of journalism, having served as a member of the History Department faculty at the University of Connecticut at Storrs, and as the director of the university's Institute for African American Studies prior to his current position at Columbia University, where he also directs the Ira A. Lipman Center for Journalism and Civil and Human Rights. Dr. Cobb is also the author of several books, including The Substance of Hope, Barack Obama and the Paradox of Progress, which was published in 2010, and the book To the Break of Dawn, a freestyle on the hip hop aesthetic. And that book was published in 2007 and was named a finalist for the National Award for Arts Writing. And Jelani is well known to many people throughout the nation for his excellent articles as a staff writer and regular contributor to the New Yorker magazine. So I'd like to begin the conversation by asking why the focus on the Kerner Commission report? And Alan, I'd like to begin with you. And I'd like for you to discuss what the 50th anniversary of Kerner meant to you as the president of the Eisenhower Foundation and as co-editor with Fred Harris, who was on the commission. I want everyone to get a sense of what you were thinking in 2017 and in 2018 when the book came out, and why you chose some of the articles that appear in the book as the trends and themes that were important to be explored. Alan.
Evelyn, thank you. Thank you to Howard University. Thank you to the Mellon Foundation. Thank you to ASALH. I'm so pleased to be with you all tonight. As Evelyn has said, the Eisenhower Foundation is really the continuation of both the Kerner Commission and the National Violence Commission, the latter being formed after the assassinations of Dr. King and Senator Kennedy. And so our mission in part is to update those two presidential commissions, both formed by President Lyndon Johnson. So I don't see this 50-year update as a book. I see it as part of our mission. And we've updated the Kerner Commission, for example, after 10 years, 25 years, 35, 40 years, and now 50. And I've been so honored in most of these updates to work with Senator Harris, who's still speaking out eloquently. We just had an event with Senator Harris recently. So this is part of what we do. And what we do goes back to a Kerner Commission that was composed mainly of privileged white men. And nonetheless, they concluded that the basic cause of the protests of the 1960s was white racism, which many young people today think is really remarkable. And part of our mission is to remind people and pass the torch of that thinking. In our update, we try to cover trends since the Kerner Commission, what works in terms of policy and political will to carry out what works. And we've certainly talked about how there have been positives since the Kerner Commission, the first African-American president, first African-American and Asian American vice president, the realities of expanded middle class among African-Americans and Latinos. Certainly lots of positives, but there have been so many negative trends, and that's important, and many of our contributors have talked about them. Racial segregation in schools has increased since the Kerner Commission. There were 200,000 people in prison at the time of the commission. There are now over 2 million. Income inequality has dramatically increased. Wealth inequality has dramatically increased. White supremacists have invaded Charlotte and invaded the US Capitol, and the murder rate today is about the same as it was back at the time of the Kerner Commission and the Violence Commission. So no change there. Those are important things that we discuss in the report with many distinguished scholars. We also talk about what works, and we have experts in economic policy like Jared Bernstein and Joe Stiglitz, and education policy like Linda Darlingham and many others, including Michael Jeffries. And so those people are all really updating the conclusions of the Kerner Commission in terms of what policy is working. And finally, we try to reflect in this update on how the Kerner Commission said, well, we know a great deal, we can propose policy, but it's not going to happen unless we have new will. And I would hope tonight that we could discuss political will, which was discussed by a number of other contributors to our 50th.
Thank you. So, Michael, I really found gripping your title, your article's title, Suffering and Citizenship. Suffering and Citizenship. Share with us what you were feeling when you chose those words for the theme, at least for the themes, because you have several themes that you wrote about in your article.
Thanks for the question, and thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. You know, I think when I began writing the essay, I was really wrestling with a couple of different pieces. One is that we have in many ways a new racial landscape in this country because of the ways demographics have changed, the growth of the Hispanic population, growing Asian American population, which is a demographic group that's growing more rapidly than any other. Really a different understanding of race and ethnicity when you talk about the complexity of ethnic heritage, the ways race intersects with gender and religion and other kinds of identity markers. But despite all those differences, the fundamental organizing principle in American politics is anti-Black racism and the oppression of Black people. Whether you talk about the ways our residential communities are organized in the places we live, access to healthcare, access to employment, education, public safety, and confrontations with the police. Those are the lines along which our society is organized. So one of the reasons I wrote the essay was really to shine a light on the continued power of anti-Black racism as an organizing principle of political and social life. So that's one piece of it. The second piece of it, the citizenship piece, I think is equally important because one of the things that has, been true from the beginning and has been dramatized in the past probably 5 to 7 years is the fact that citizenship is about practice, right? Citizenship is not about a kind of one-time granting of rights. Citizenship only exists to the extent that you practice it. And what we've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests around the killing of George Floyd are nothing short of proof of that idea. And Black folks' experience as partial at best citizens of this country for a long time demonstrates how tenuous, how fragile our kind of imagined notion of citizenship truly is. So now when we're faced with an authoritarian threat or a fascist threat, other folks are sort of waking up to a kind of contingent citizenship that Black folk have known as reality for a long time. So those are why I kind of settled on those two themes for the essay.
Thank you. And Jelani, I was struck by your statement, and I'd like to quote from your book. You say, but the timing is important, if only because the Kerner report was fated from the moment it reached shelves to operate more crucially as a forecast than a review. A forecast than a review. So I'm interested in your timing. Why did you feel it's so important now to return to this particular document and to write your extensive introduction and for you to distill the commission's report into its essential findings, as you call it, for your readers?
Sorry. There's a lot to be said about the tremendous job that the Kerner report did of incorporating history more thoroughly than any of the other genre of reports, because there had been very many of these reports in response to what they bureaucratically referred to as civil disturbances. But there'd been a report in 1965, the McCone report about Watts,
there'd been that report about Newark, which is, I think, 12 volumes or so. It's gigantic. I went to the library at Rutgers and requested that report, and I was shocked when the librarian came back with a cart with all of these volumes on them. And so, they're going all the way back to the report in 1935 that E. Franklin Frazier worked on, about the uprising in Harlem. And so there had been examinations of these sorts of societal disturbances before, but Kerner is unique in its scope and the breadth of its historical analysis. And one of the reasons that, at the time, people thought that this was something really worth reading. But the irony of it is that, of course, it was delivered 3 weeks before Martin Luther King was assassinated, and cities across the country exploded. And so in popular perception, those things have been conflated. People think that Kerner came out to discuss the events that happened after King's death, and not as a kind of preface to that moment. So at its inception, just in a span of 3 weeks, people were looking back to what the Kerner Commission report said. And we could not know at that time that in subsequent years, the Kerner Commission's name would be invoked, in the aftermath of 1980 in Miami, with Arthur McDuffie, the motorcyclist who was beaten to death by 5 Miami police officers. And despite the testimony of one of the officers who said, "We beat him to death," all 4 of the other officers were acquitted and the city of Miami exploded. Or that Kerner would be invoked again in 1992 in the aftermath of Rodney King's brutal beating, or that we would see Kerner discussed in 2014 amid the uprisings in Ferguson. And again, and this is just skipping over all the other instances that we could talk about. And so when we get to 2020 and we see George Floyd, and we have already passed the 50-year mark where this report is still being invoked, which has given it a kind of afterlife that most government reports never see. We could only think that maybe the 9/11 report and the Warren Commission report, looking at the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the only government reports that readily come to mind that have a kind of public recognition in the way that Kerner does. But those reports discuss, kind of singular moments and singular incidents. Kerner discusses an active, dynamic, ongoing phenomenon. And that is why we've never been able to get away from it, and why I thought the report needed to be brought out again and distilled down to the parts that spoke most directly to the times, and that people could look at and say, "Oh wow," because it was so comprehensive, at 600-700 pages, that they discuss a wide array of things. And I was like, what if we just distilled this down to the parts that most speak to the moment that we're in, and we can kind of bring this into the parameters of the conversation we're having right now.
One of the things I think that all of you say is that Kerner was prescient. It was futuristic in many ways. He talked about issues that we will talk about some of that today. But it wasn't, it may have been talking about what happened then, but the way it talked about it, some of the policies are still needing to be realized in this moment. I found interesting what you said, Alan, about mostly white men. So I'm going to give you just one little background about this. So, and you do know that Roy Wilkins was on there, but the general counsel was a Black man named McCurdy. And My friend, the late Judge Nathaniel Jones, was also on that staff. He was the assistant legal counsel to General Counsel McCurdy. He was one of, I think, 3 assistant legal counsels. And I had the opportunity of working with Judge Jones on his autobiography and even wrote the foreword to it. And I recall his descriptions of being on fact-finding teams to the various cities. So I wanted to quote him for you. I'm quoting from Answering the Call. So Nathaniel Jones writes this. He says, community members refused for a period of time to communicate with our field investigators because of their distrust of the police and any federal investigators. So when we think of this thing being written, and I think it's you, Jelani, that also makes the comparison with Gunnar Myrdal. For both these reports, you've got other people who are gathering information, and these teams for Kerner, these field reports, were really important. And so when Nathaniel Jones talks about this, he goes on to say that there was a need to literally reconstitute some of those teams to gain the trust of the individuals whom they were interviewing. And so it made me think about how important it is for people to be able to speak openly about their grievances. And one of the reasons I think the Kerner report was so good was because people did speak openly, because they tried to put a field team out there. Nate Jones was on some of those field teams. He headed some of them. So I come back to you, Alan, because just to talk about the police, as Nathaniel Jones is saying, is uncomfortable. But they did. And as you know, the Kerner Commission identified 12 grievances leading to urban rebellions and listed as number 1 the problem of police practices. So talk to us about this issue of the police as you were thinking about it, and as you're still thinking about it in terms of the report.
And just a note about those field teams, both of us are familiar with Milwaukee, where I grew up, and Senator Harris and John Lindsay spent a lot of time in Milwaukee as part of those field teams gathering information. Senator Harris actually sat in barbershops on the north side of Milwaukee in the African-American neighborhoods and got a lot of his information because people down in City Hall weren't communicating to him. But in terms of police, it was a high priority in the Kerner Commission. The Kerner Commission severely criticized the police for its brutality, for its violence, police violence before and during the disturbances and the protests, and offered recommendations that essentially talked about how police and community needed to work better together. There was some talk about pursuing that after the Kerner Commission, but nothing really happened. We got into a law and order administration, and in many ways, the notion of zero tolerance policing reigned supreme for many of the decades after the Kerner Commission. So many of us fought against zero tolerance, and finally enough evidence built up to prove that it really didn't work. But today we still don't have any real serious effort to change police culture. That systemic reality is still with us. And as we approach the 2024 and 2022 elections, I think that many policymakers and politicians want to stay away from the police because they don't want to rock the boat in terms of who votes for whom. And that's really unfortunate, I think, because we have built up evidence on how the police could proceed based on thinking of the Kerner Commission. In our foundation, the Eisenhower Foundation, for example, we have really carefully evaluated community police partnerships that mentor youth, that work in the neighborhood, that reduce crime and fear, and start to change police culture. And we've been able to do that in a diversity of locations. Hunters Point in San Francisco, public housing in Columbia, South Carolina, the poorest neighborhood in San Juan, Puerto Rico. And in those and other cases, there have been safe havens created, which then serve as magnets for other citizen programs. So, for example, today we talk about the Cahoots program in Eugene, Oregon, where there are civilians doing mental health work to take some of that burden away from police. And there is the mediation program directed by formerly incarcerated people in New York City, the Cure Violence program, where the citizen organizations there are collaborating very well with police. And so that potential exists, it's just not being pursued. And so we argue, for example, that there really needs to be a White House conference. Bring in NOBLE, the National Organization of Black Elected Officials. Bring in Black Lives Matter. Bring in the National Mentoring Initiative people. Bring in community action people. Have a real serious discourse with Black Lives Matter on how we could actually proceed with integrating community, youth, and police. And that's where I'd like personally to see us going once we can get over perhaps this next election.
You know, listening when you first started, also in answering the call, Nathaniel Jones notes that it is Fred Harris, also John Wagner, the mayor of New York. The two of them are the ones who came up with the idea of the field teams and working, you know, getting people to walk through neighborhoods and to find that out. So that was a really important fact gathering way to do things. But, you know, this idea of the police, I'm just wondering, Michael and Jelani, if you wanted to also make comments about this.
Yeah, you know, I think that Kerner was one of the other things that was important in that report, which also the 1935 report looks at, but it looks at policing in the context of other forms of inequality. And so, you know, if people look at this as just a problem of police policy, then it curtails that bigger conversation that Kerner really put at front and center. That you had to talk about education, you had to talk about healthcare, you had to talk about housing, you had to talk about employment and underemployment. They make a brilliant observation, which is kind of tucked into a footnote, that people in the ghetto, as they called it then, the terminology people use, people in the ghetto have too much contact with police, period. And that each instance of contact carries with it the possibility of something going disastrously wrong, and that there needed to be alternate social structures and social services that will allow people to access the facilities and assistance of the city without accessing and being in contact with law enforcement. Well, 50 years later, people who were saying defund the police, that was literally what they were arguing. And so the genealogy of that idea, although it's considered something that was, you know, has its foothold in the far left now in our politics, or at least the progressive left, you know, is among these fairly moderate individuals in 1968, which also says something about where our political train has shifted to since then. The other thing that I think is notable is that, you know, Kerner had its points that did not age well. One of the most astounding was a footnote which gave acknowledgement and expressed gratitude to the insights of one California police captain, LAPD police department captain, who was instrumental in understanding the best practices, for them to understand the best practices of policing during riots, and how police could effectively curtail violence while kind of respecting citizens. And the officer who they thanked in that footnote was named Daryl Gates.
Oh my goodness. And tell the audience who Daryl Gates was.
If you don't know who Daryl Gates was,
they might not remember Rodney
responsible for the only uprising that was bigger than Watts, which was Los Angeles in 1992. He eventually ascended from being a captain to being the chief of the LAPD, and reigned over one of the most rogue, violent, and unprofessional eras in the Los Angeles Police Department, culminating in the brutal beating of Rodney King. And so to think that this is the person who's giving you your best practices advice, that one didn't age well.
He practiced what he preached.
Right.
Did you want to say anything, Michael?
No, I think that says plenty if you want to go on to the next one.
Well, thank you. So, Michael, and I'm also going to give another shout out to answering the call by Nathaniel R. Jones. And it was specifically his discussion about labeling persons as rioters and agitators. And again, the distrust that community folks felt when those kind of words were used in conversation with them. And this is what he writes there. He says, quote, "I was among those who argued within the staff and to the media that ghetto residents were too often mislabeled and castigated as, quote, rioters, rather than understood as, quote, victims." Well, Michael, this theme of who is the victim dovetails with your focus on Black Lives Matter in your article. And it's really interesting because you're writing, I guess, in 2017 or so. And when you're writing in 2017, there's been a lot of different kind of talk about the effectiveness of Black Lives Matter. And you are trying to put the organization in a perspective that is a corrective to some of those speculations. Well, obviously by 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, you have been proven correct. So I'd like for you to share some of your thoughts about that. And I'm also curious as we think about now, especially because George Floyd, when that occurred, we were in the pandemic. So how does COVID factor into your thinking, or does it?
Okay, yeah, thanks for the question. I'll try to take a couple of different pieces of it. When I wrote the essay, one of the things I wrote about the Black Lives Matter movement was that almost regardless of what it was actually advocating for, perhaps its greatest success was proving the importance of participatory democracy, proving the importance of political mobilization beyond voting. And what we saw in the immediate aftermath was an uptick in mass demonstrations and the willingness, the desire to go out in the street and participate in public demonstrations of freedom of assembly and freedom of speech by younger folk. And that sort of momentum carried directly into the Women's March, which at the time was the largest such demonstration in the history of our country in 2017 after the election of Trump. Now, Since that time, right, the protests and demonstrations in the aftermath of the Floyd killing have dwarfed the numbers of the Women's March. I mean, we're talking about, you know, estimates of more than 20 million participants when you tally everything up. You're talking about a movement that lasted 18 months as a conservative estimate just in the US, not to mention its impact around the globe. And I think that what Black Lives Matter did, at least as a very kind of basic and major contribution, was it showed the power of these kinds of public demonstrations and the necessity of such public demonstrations to have anything kind of resembling a political lifeline, a chance at a decent political culture and a chance at dignity for the folks they were representing. So that's the first piece of it. The second piece of it, and this speaks directly to the question that we just discussed, one of the most powerful things that we all witnessed during these protests and demonstrations was the response of the state and police in particular to nonviolent protest. So we had protests about police violence, and we had incontrovertible evidence of the police responding with violence, right? Not only toward the demonstrators, but toward the press, who are supposed to be neutral sort of bystanders, only there in the name of democracy and free speech, apolitical in some regard, right? And they still got it, right? We're talking about rubber bullets, smoke, and police batons, et cetera, et cetera. So the power, right? The power of these demonstrations was proof of its own concept, right? It was proof of concept. They were saying, this is the problem. You can make all of these other excuses around crime and pathology and quote unquote rioters, but look right in front of your face. Look at what the police do to us. And when pushed, what they will do to you, non-Black viewers and residents of our country. And I think that's what's maybe sort of given them so much lasting power, unfortunately, is, you know, sometimes, oftentimes when Black folks suffer, right, it's not enough for the rest of the country to get up in arms about it. But what it has revealed, what the demonstrations and the protests have revealed, is that everyone is vulnerable to this type of violence and abuse at the hands of the police when they're pushed. And I think that's one of its true lasting lessons. And the final piece of this, just because you asked about the pandemic, I'll mention it very briefly and we can return to it. The fact that the Floyd protests intensified during the pandemic speaks, I think, to a couple of things. One, the power of social media, right? We were all in our homes communicating, doom scrolling through Twitter and Instagram, and that, no doubt, that contributed to a sense of crisis. But again, when people were able to overcome their fear of the pandemic and say, this moment, this crisis is so important to me, pandemic be damned, I have to get out in the street right now if I want to survive, if I want my kids to survive. That also contributed to the power of the movement, right? Its urgency became kind of self-evident and self-actualizing, and it gave people meaning in a time when there was so much despair because of the pandemic.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I add
Alan
just-
Jelani?
Yeah, can I add one quick thing to this? I mean, I think the central thing, you know, to Michael's point, is that the system went on a self-incrimination spree in the aftermath of George Floyd's death. And so what became apparent was that there were no alternatives to violence. Like, this was what American policing knew to confront problems with violence and to resolve them. Even in the instances of this, so what has happened, I think one of the wedges that that occurred and driving catalysts, I would say, that occurred early on, was something that we've seen in previous movements, wherein a portion of the public that was not aware previously became aware of the extent to which white supremacy was willing to harm white people in defense of maintaining its hierarchy over Black people. And that has been historically a an epiphany in the making for very many white people, or a revelation for very many white people. So when you were seeing, white protesters being brutalized, and to Michael's point about that not being, the suffering of Black people not being enough, even we saw that 75-year-old man in Buffalo who was shoved to the ground and suffered brain damage, bleeding, as a hemorrhaging as a result of his injuries, and the numerous other instances that were happening in cities where there were negligible Black populations. It became like people who had the effect of people who saw what happened to Viola Liuzzo, or what happened to Goodman and Schwerner, or what happened to, going all the way kind of through this, back to the abolitionist era, of white people being harmed in these instances. And I think that was part of a dynamic that Black people have been aware of, but by and large, white America has been unaware of. And it had the galvanizing effect that it had.
I think that the framing hasn't changed much. In 1968, white folks talked about riots and people of color talked about protests. In 2020, it was basically the same thing.
I'll tell you though, I do find it, I don't know if ironic is the right word, but for January 6th, when these same people who supported the police brutality of the Black Lives Matter people are the same people who are attacking the police at the Capitol. And yet that somehow is comprehensible. I just find that really hypocritical, to be quite candid.
Can I say one thing about language? Which is, I have not shied away from using the term riot, only because we have utilized the term riot as it pertains to the American Revolution in numerous instances. But we do not presume that the word riot carries an apolitical context, in those affairs, in those moments, in instances. So the word riot, although I tend not to use it just because, you don't want to go through the whole explanation of it, but the selective depoliticization of the term is something that we have to think about in its own terms. Because history is littered with bread riots and all sorts of other riots that we understand to be completely political acts. But in the instances of what's happened in the United States, particularly in the 1960s, riot took on a kind of connotation of lawless, apolitical hooliganism. And the word has meanings that are deeply defined by context. I think rebellion is probably better to because
that's what people are using now, rebellion.
Yeah, we'd have to go through the entire explanation that we just walked through. But I push back against the idea that riot implicitly meant that these were not political affairs.
Exactly. That's very interesting. Well, Jelani, I have a question for you, and that is this, that, when I read the Kerner Commission report, and for anybody who reads it, you always have to take a breath and just stop and ponder when you read the testimony of Kenneth Clark. Now, you actually alluded to this by mentioning some of those reports, but I just want to read from the Kerner Commission report, the testimony of Kenneth Clark. And he says this: I read that report of the 1919 riot in Chicago, and it is as if I were reading the report of the investigating committee on the Harlem riot of 1935, the report of the investigating committee on the Harlem riot of 1943, the commission report the report of the Kerner Commission on the Watts riot, and that would have been 65. And then he says, I must again in candor say to you members of this commission, it is a kind of Alice in Wonderland with the same moving picture, reshown over and over again, the same analysis, the same recommendations, and the same inaction. And those are powerful words. And I thought about you, Jelani, because I found really helpful your appendix at the very end of your book. And what, for readers, what Jelani Cobb does is he gives questions that people would ask. And he has a number of really interesting questions. But one of the questions that stuck out in my mind as I thought about what Kenneth Clark said was this question, and I quote you, the report says that we have two different societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. That was 1967. We've since had a Black president. So you're raising that as a question that would come from people who would say, well, is that true? Jelani, do you think this assessment is still the case today? That we have two different societies, one Black, one white, separate, one equal, because we've had a Black president. Would you answer in the way that Kenneth Clark did if you were interviewed by a commission today?
Yeah, by and large, yes. And I think that the issue of the Black presidency has been, I was in a taxi in London, and I was talking with an African brother who was comparing the circumstances of Black people in the UK to Black people in the United States. And this was not long after Obama had been elected. And he was going on and on and on about Obama and the presidency, and and how much further along Black people were in the United States, and it was getting more and more uncomfortable. And then finally, I told him, I said, there are 40 million of us in the United States, only 4 named with the last name Obama, and so I said that can't be taken to be a barometer, and the other useful comparison is the number of societies we've seen that have had female heads of state that remain, deeply patriarchal societies, and societies in which women still don't have full equality. And those two things can coexist. And it seems to be, difficult to hold those thoughts in your mind, but it totally is true, because we still see the entrenched disparities in every institution that produces outcomes. We can see those outcomes correlated by race in some way, shape, or form. And so that is a reality that white people in this country, by and large, are excluded from, even poor white people. The nature of white poverty being different than the nature of Black poverty in this country. And so I think that's true. The reason why I hesitate a little bit is I think that we also have to bear in mind that the efforts of people who came before us actually have yielded some change. And so I was talking to someone who had a very pessimistic view of things and was like, I don't know why we bother, because nothing ever changes. And when we look at the gap in high school graduation from 1968, when Kerner came out, to present, it has narrowed tremendously. The gap in college graduation has narrowed tremendously. The numbers of Black people who are attending college quintupled in some span from the 1970s into the 2000s. Especially Black entrepreneurship numbers, the numbers of Black people who are elected to political office, the level of representation that Black people have in these areas. Now, if we're talking about economic dynamics, we would see a picture that's different, for reasons that we know. We see, but even with healthcare, where there are kind of complicated, and countervailing forces, over the course of the 20th century, we've seen that gap in mortality narrow, but given it was a chasm before, it's still a gulf. but it has narrowed. And, you know, Black women had the overall largest increase in life expectancy of any demographic in the 20th century. And so I think that those things don't happen accidentally. I'm very quick, I tell my students all the time, my father had a 3rd grade education. The extent of his literacy was writing his name. I have a PhD. That does not happen accidentally. That happens because people put their shoulder to the wheel of history and said, we can actually make differences.
Absolutely.
I started joking with Senator Harris about our needing to start writing the 75th anniversary update of the Kerner Commission. He may just do it.
I would not put it past him.
And that implies the realities that Kenneth Clark talked about. But I would also say, in accord with what Jelani said, Dr. King never gave up. Dr. King kept pushing, and it seems to me that's what we have to do. There are all the negatives that I try to suggest, but there is this progress. So can we not try in the decades ahead to increase the ratio of positive trends to negative trends?
Michael, do you want to say anything about this? You're muted. Yeah.
I think, you know, I think what my colleagues have said is absolutely right. And the point about taking the long view here is a really, really important one. The other thing I would say is that if you just take the short view, right, you can see the change that's possible in a very short period of time. Jelani mentioned the proportion of not only folks winning elected office, but running for elected office. The folks coming out to vote, period. That's been a huge trend. And really, just the power, and voting, I think, is a somewhat shallow measure or measuring stick for what a healthy political culture looks like. We need to think of political culture beyond voting. But without the Black electorate, we're living in a very different society today than we would be otherwise. I mean, we know that this most recent election was driven by the mobilization and the voting of Black people and the leadership of Black women in particular, right? So that reality shows us the fact that we have agency and efficacy and power in spite of the really truly cemented patterns of institutional racism that continue to hold us back.
I always like to keep my mind on the progress as well as the setbacks. And we are in a moment of setback. We are, with these new laws, just about teaching history. Laws about voting. I mean, this is a retrenchment. But you have to think positive about how to get through this. And the only way I know how to do it is to just be mindful of all these people who got us where we are, you know, the John Lewises, just so many people who put their lives on the line to get us where we are at a time when things were so much worse. I mean, ASALH right now is commemorating, it is our annual theme of Black health and wellness. And as late as the early 1960s, you had hospitals that wouldn't even let Black people in. You know, you had cases in the early 1960s, in a case in North Carolina, where they're fighting just to be able to get served services and medical services in a hospital. And so I do think we need to be ever mindful of the struggle just has to continue. It just has to It just has to keep moving. And I think this is a good place to think about, especially before we turn to our audience, to think about being forward-looking. You know, Alan, in your book, and even though you have articles, people should buy the book, because for the first 8 chapters, it's just the editor's writing. And in that 8th chapter, you have this, it's called New Will. And it's insightful. And it's a thoughtful update to what the Kerner Commission called New Will in its time. So what does New Will mean in our challenging time today? What are some of the things that you talked about in that chapter, and they're still relevant?
Well, I think that's the most difficult question. The Kerner Commission set out policy that was solid: economic, education, right down the line. In our updates, we always try to document policies that work across the board, that need to be combined, co-targeted. But we always come back to how the Kerner Commission said all our policy recommendations can't come to fruition without, quote, new will. And we find that is exactly the same today. We still don't have new will. And as we talk around the country, that discussion most frustrates our audience, and it frustrates us as well, because we're not really sure what this means. And I would hope that tonight we maybe can make some progress. If you ask how do you create new will, at least in my mind, I say today, given the upcoming elections this year and in 2024, the most important strategy is to reinforce voting rights and to reverse voter suppression. Well, that's a huge topic. We could be talking 8 hours more tonight on that. Federally, we need to modify the filibuster and pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the other major piece of legislation, both of which are pending. And at the state level, we need to we really need voter education campaigns that are much better financed by major foundations, just to let people know about the voter suppression that has occurred since 2020, and to get people registered in the old-fashioned way, and to get them to the polls. And then, you know, this includes recognition that in Georgia, it's now against the law to give folks who are standing in line to vote water and food. This is really quite amazing and quite remarkable. And unless we do something about these realities, we could be in the wilderness for quite a while. Then what do you do beyond that? Well, I'm not sure. I think we can go back to Build Back Better and say there are certain policies that were proposed that didn't get passed, like child tax credits, that we should try to get passed now, because voters would like that. They're popular with voters, and that could increase voting for Kerner-like priorities in the future. I think we need to look at evidence. We need to look at curricula that teach high school students how to understand misinformation and how to understand what evidence-based policy means. We need to have honest history. So that's another 8 hours on CRT. That's part of creating new will. And just finally, just one other suggestion. I think we need to try to push the performing arts and the visual arts into the direction of creating new will. For example, Bishop Barber, the continuation of Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign. Bishop Barber's moral fusion movement uses performing arts and song as Dr. King utilized Aretha Franklin and Mahalia Jackson. And Dr. Barber is so eloquent on the power of song. Sometimes the pain is so bad you can only sing. And he has a diversity of audiences, which I think is important. He projects to the people who are already in accord with him, but he also tries to project to independents and people on the borderline, and even people who are opposed to Kerner priorities. That's very important to Bishop Barber. And finally, for the visual arts, we've been working with people like Hank Willis Thomas and his national organization with activist artists across the country to do projects, to do billboards, to do meetings that in effect focus on Kerner priorities. And that in many kind of Sarah Lewis ways also reminds us of Frederick Douglass and how he stressed the importance of imagery in the movement. So I would want, at least in our foundation's work, to continue trying to push the visionaries in the arts to be part of the movement to create a new will.
It's truly a great thought. And you know what else I found interesting is when I was looking at the Kerner report and they were identifying the grievances, one of the grievances was that they weren't being taught Black history. That was literally one of the grievances. And it is certainly a threat, you know, it's a threatened issue today. And so I think that's another theme that should be brought out. As you talk about these cultural narratives, definitely Black history needs to be one of the themes that is important for New Will today. Now, Michael, you insist on the need to, what you say, turn good research, like the Kerner report, into good policy. Well, if we know what's wrong, why is change so difficult? How can we change? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, you know, I think that the answer to that last piece of the question is, you know, it's difficult to change because of the structure of the government that we have and the willingness of opponents to change, to use really every tool in their toolbox to maintain power. And you talked about the moment of retrenchment that we're in. I think that's an excellent way to describe it. White supremacy as a political system doesn't really care about the rules, the stated rules of a functioning democracy. And we've seen white supremacy as a political system reassert itself during this most recent era of sort of governmental crisis. So I think that's the answer to why it's so difficult. The government is structured that way, and opponents have made their priorities really clear. We have to take them seriously. The bigger question, what can we do about it? How do we turn good research into good policy? I try to think about this from a couple of different angles. One is from my position in the academy, right? As a member of the professoriate and now as an administrator, I think there are too many barriers between researchers and the policy world. And there are also barriers in the academy that prevent especially more junior researchers from stepping out in front of an issue and really engaging the public in relatable and understandable language. So I think part of our job for those of us who work in universities and colleges is to create a space where researchers feel comfortable with that type of engagement and are rewarded institutionally for that kind of engagement by their specific institutions and by the academy as a whole. So I think that's one thing, is changing the incentive structure of the university so that researchers can reach out and don't feel like they're going to be somehow penalized by others in their circle. Another piece of this goes back to what I said before, you know, to really think about the power of public opinion and the ability of public protest and public demonstration to shift public opinion. So if you look at the history of the Supreme Court, for example, many times they're not leading public opinion, they're following. This is especially true if you look at the history of LGBTQ plus rights in this country. Every sort of favorable decision, almost every favorable decision the court has offered has come after public opinion had already swung in the direction of a more liberal polity on that issue. And I think that that kind of speaks to, again, the power of public demonstration to shift public opinion. Then the final thing I'll say about this good research to good policy question is to think locally and not just nationally. So the example I like to point to is how close we have been, how close some folk have been at the local level to seeing dramatic change in some of these issues. And the case I point to is the case of the city of Minneapolis, which in November 21 had a ballot measure essentially to dissolve the Minneapolis Police Department. This was a radical, truly imaginative, ambitious act, right, to get a ballot measure, and it went to a vote, and 43% of the voters voted for it, voted to dissolve the police department and replace it with sort of a public health agency that wasn't under the mayor's control. Now, when you read the stories about this ballot measure, what you'll read is that it failed because 56% voted against it. But we have to understand that 43% voting for it is a tremendous success. It's an earth-shattering success, right? To think that 43% of people in a major city on a ballot measure to dissolve the police department almost won. So I think that's the kind of fuel that we can kind of contribute to our political imagination and get us to think about the power of local change as some of these national trends appear to be so intimidating and entrenched.
Very, very interesting.
I think there's so much that the Academy can do in terms of reaching out. I think Michael is so right on there. And when he said that, I was thinking we had an event with Elizabeth Hinton and with the Barred Prison Initiative, and it would be really consonant with the priorities of the Kerner Commission if many universities would do what the Barred Prison Initiative is doing. That is offering courses to people who are incarcerated, courses for credit, and then they get to graduate with a degree eventually. That is just one little illustration of what I think universities should be doing in terms of reaching out into the community.
PBS had a documentary, I think, on that. I think it was the BARD program. They had a documentary of various, well, these were faculty members who were going into the prisons, teaching all kinds of classes. But I guess one of the things, this hopeful discussion, hopeful, Michael, that you raised about the local, and I do think it's really important. And I don't like to be cynical, but it seems like that local is what's happening on the reverse. I think of what's happening in Florida about teaching, about LGBTQ. I think about what happened in Virginia, about just teaching race. These are local initiatives that are also gaining support. This is what really frightens me. Jelani, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I also think, I was thinking about what Michael was saying about the role of the Academy in this. And one of the things that we have to be mindful of is the fact that we are not immune from the forces that we see sweeping the country. Just maybe 2 weeks ago, the Lieutenant Governor of Texas was talking about using the stalking horse, the Trojan horse of critical race theory, as a mechanism for getting rid of tenure, which is something that people on the right have wanted to do for a really long time. Now, of course, this is something that they hypothetically want to do, but in reality, they are quite attached to the prestige that comes with, having a University of Texas in Austin, or having University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And we saw what happened with Nicole Hannah-Jones and her tenure approval process there. And so there is the reality that whatever we do, we have to also be mindful of protecting people who are in the academy themselves. They're not outside of this equation. One of the biggest potentially chilling effects of this crusade against critical race theory is on untenured assistant professors whose work relates to that field of study. And it is not inconceivable that some government-appointed or governor-appointed individual at the level of the board of a university will interject to block the tenure of a professor whose work is completely respectable, completely valid, but goes against their political beliefs. And that's part of the dynamic of this equation too. And so I guess that's simply my addendum, is to say that we will really have to be fighting on all of these fronts.
Jelani, I also wanted you to have a word from your book too, though, which would be forward-looking, because you do say that your recommendations, you have recommendations that embrace 3 basic principles. I would like for you to share those principles with our audience.
Oh, wait, I'm not quite sure.
Did I? Okay, well, I'm sorry.
What did I say here?
Well, it said you write this in your introduction to the Kerner Commission. You say our recommendations embrace 3 basic principles. I don't, well, I can't. Well, you probably have stated them already, so we will open up to the audience.
I have, but I'm not one of those people who actually remembers everything they've written, so I have to go back and look.
Well, I do.
But if anybody else is interested,
myself even.
This is the book. You can purchase it and find out for yourself what those 3 recommendations are.
Okay. So
Evelyn,
Michelle, now, if we could open it up to our audience.
Yeah, I just want to, I want to say that we know Jelani is going to be leaving a little early. And so we want to make sure we get a couple questions that he can join in. I think he has maybe 10 or 15 minutes before he has to jump off, and we will continue a little after that. So I'm going to turn it over to the team here to let you know some of the questions.
Awesome. Our first question says, would Jelani Cobb agree, despite his very informative point on the historical use of the word riot in historical political analysis, that in current times, 2018 to 2022, white people using the word riot is more of a function of their view of the people involved rather than their view of the action in question? And this comes from Earl Yates.
Sure. Yeah, I think that was kind of implicit in the point that I was trying to make, that the language is used pejoratively, specifically because of who it is referred to. And just like the word public, which used to have a positive connotation, that once the word public became associated with people of color, which they stigmatized through things like public housing or public transportation or public education, which became code words for Black people. Now public is a word that carries a negative connotation. And I think that, the same sort of dynamic is at play with the word riot.
Our next question came from Don Harrell, who asked, how do we as a society navigate the ill effect of misinformation as a political tool?
I can take a swing at this one first, and then I'd really love to hear my colleagues' thoughts about it. Again, I think this is a place where folk in the academy have a very, very large role to play, and educators really throughout the country have a large role to play. Thinking about literacy, and in terms of news consumption, like news literacy, media literacy, that's a phrase that's been around for a while, but it's never been more desperately needed than it is now. So teaching young folk to really understand how they consume information, what a legitimate source is, what an illegitimate source is. I think that's a huge part of this issue, is not just taking a reactive approach to kind of batting down misinformation, but really taking a forward-looking preemptive approach so that we have an educated citizenry, a media literate citizenry that can do that kind of work for itself. So that's one piece of it. The second piece of it, I think, is really understanding that often the way to engage folks who occupy a political position that is different, and especially really quite polarized from where you sit, entering those situations armed with a whole bunch of arguments and evidence is unlikely to actually shift their opinion and change their mind. The things that we know, that we've learned from political organizers about the importance of face-to-face contact, about the importance of narrative, about the importance of emotional connection, not just tweets and Instagram and TikTok, but actually reaching out, sharing space with someone, telling them your story. Those kind of face-to-face interactions are the most potent tools in many ways that we have to address all forms of polarization, including those that are exacerbated by misinformation. So those are two of the things that I think about, is not just taking a reactive approach and arguing against misinformation, but taking a preemptive approach and a proactive approach and teaching media literacy and thinking about misinformation, the combating of misinformation, not just in terms of argumentation and evidence, but in terms of personal connection and face-to-face organizing. Those are where my mind goes.
In terms of misinformation, there are some countries, Scandinavian countries and Finland especially, that have created curricula for high school students that seems to be working in terms of letting them sort out what really is important. And to me, that does link in turn to evidence-based policy. I'm always talking about evidence-based policy, and sometimes I might say, oh, there's an RCT that shows that our youth mentoring program works. But I think Michael is right. So many people in our society base policy on supposition and dogma. And so how do you get beyond that? And having the narratives that Michael talks about is I think, one important way.
Can I add this too? Because the discussion about the basic principles, I don't think came from Jelani. I think this actually came out of the report. So just tell me if this is right. I'm so sorry, Jelani.
Yeah. So
but
yeah,
it's so relevant. It's so relevant. So can I just read this? It's so relevant, and I think it even speaks to what Michael and Alan were just saying. But I'm reading from your book here. It says, it is time now to turn with all purpose at our command to the major unfinished business of this nation. It's time to adopt strategies for actions that will produce quick and visible progress. It's time to make good the promises of American democracy to all citizens, urban and rural, white and Black, Spanish surname, American Indian, and every minority group. And these are the three recommendations, the basic principles. One, to mount programs on a scale equal to the dimension of the problems. And that is really important. How do you mount programs that are equal to the dimension of the problems? To aim these programs for high impact in the immediate future in order to close the gap between promise and performance. And then third, to undertake new initiatives and experiments that can change the system of failure and frustration that now dominates the ghetto and weakens our society. Now, maybe I thought you were saying that because it sounds so absolutely today, but that actually came from the Kerner Commission and not from Jelani Cobb.
Yeah, I'm glad we clarified that. Wait, did I say that?
But Evelyn, I mean, scaling up to the dimension, expanding what works at a scale equal to the dimensions of the problem continues to be the issue. And that gets us right back into new will. There's a lot that works. Preschool works, so we should have it for every kid in the country.
Michelle, you can, yeah, Nick, thank you.
Yeah, we have two complementary questions. So the first was from Kurt Dunbar. K through 12, especially high school teachers, are suffering under the oppression and reaction against race and gender even being mentioned. How can we in higher education assist our beleaguered counterparts in compañeros? The other complementary question says, what options do ordinary citizens have to combat the assault on CRT?
I mean, I can take the second one. I think that one, ordinary citizens, first we need to be educated about what CRT is. And this is something I've been saying, everywhere that I have the opportunity, that when people would say, oh, CRT is this biased attempt to damage the emotional well-being of white children, which was not true. And then you heard kind of progressives saying CRT is just American history, which they took to mean kind of validating kind of all anti-racist curricula, but that's not CRT either. And so, CRT in its strictest sense is a body of legal scholarship, relating to how social hierarchies are reinscribed despite attempts to reform and policy that is allegedly oriented toward reform. And so I think we have to be very clear about that, but I think that it's important that we push back, that we organize around people who are making use of that term erroneously or disingenuously. I think that this has to do with what your voting behavior is. I also think that for people who are being tainted as critical race theorists in an attempt to turn the term pejoratively, we should really be supporting those works, buying the books that are being banned and being pushed out, insisting that they be available in public libraries. The state of Oklahoma is trying to regulate books that have some CRT inclination and get them out of their public libraries. And so all of those things I think are necessary, but we have to wage these fights from an educated standpoint. So I think one of the first things that we need to do is actually understand what CRT is.
I don't have too much to add to that. I would just maybe offer one word about the connection between public educators and folks who are professional researchers in universities and colleges. I think that another piece of this story to me has been the kind of longstanding pattern of wealthy colleges and universities, despite being located in areas that are proximate to public schools, right near public schools, really kind of closing the gates and kind of building our own sort of existence outside of, in many respects, the existence of our neighbors and our communities. And I think universities and colleges have a lot of reckoning to do when it comes to the resource extraction of that kind of behavior and the missed opportunities to really strengthen what education is if we provided more ways to bring our faculty and our students out of our classrooms and into other community spaces, including community centers and local schools that would have us. Plenty of education scholars, you mentioned Dr. Darling Hammond, she could speak to this certainly better than I can, have been doing this their entire careers, right? Bridging these gaps, working on curriculum reform, working on pedagogy and the development of professional development of teachers. This is work that we in the university and colleges do really quite well, but delivering it right into the spaces of instructions, public spaces of instruction, K through 12, is not always our kind of strongest suit. So I think we need to be able to redouble our efforts and commit to not just producing the research, but actually building and sustaining and mutually enforcing connections between the communities and the neighborhoods that we live in and the academy.
I also wanted to add just about for high school teachers, K through 12 all the way. ASALH has long had what we call our teachers workshop, where we talk about these themes. We have our executive council member, Jarvis Givens, who's written a book called Fugitive Pedagogy, where he talks about the era when a lot of high school teachers had to teach covertly. They would have to teach with the book in their lap, hidden, but they still taught Black history. I do think we're going to have to begin to think about a lot of strategies, because our children have to learn the truth. And teachers, I was a high school teacher, so I do understand how important this is for our students to know the truth of their history. Ellen, I think you wanted to say something?
Evelyn,
Uh-huh.
just let me interrupt for a minute so that we can thank Jelani for joining us. I know that he needed to sign off early, and we so appreciate your wisdom and your comments today. I don't know if you'd like to add anything, Evelyn.
Thank you as always, Jelani.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's good being with you.
Ellen, I didn't know if you wanted to say something about the teacher angle, but this is one of the major initiatives that ASALH is interested in. And in fact, let me just say that we have branches. Our branches span the nation. Many of our branch members are teachers, K through 12 teachers. So the person who asked that question, I would love for you to make your, contact us so that we can connect you with people and some of the projects that we do with schools even at this moment, and with high school students even at this moment.
I was just agreeing with all of you in terms of community outreach. It would seem to me that it's important for the academic world to communicate to common people what CRT means, to get beyond the way it's being used today as a political football.
All right, our next question is a little lengthy, but it's still wonderful. This is, so it's from Pat Franklin. This is rarely discussed concept in my circle, but some of why anti-Black racism persists decade after decade is what has been mentioned by the speakers, that it is safer for whites to not challenge the status quo because, one, they may be physically harmed or threatened, but more often they are socially and economically ostracized, which is a price they are not willing to make. So they may not condone racism, but it benefits them in many ways to allow it to persist and not push back. Any thoughts about how we can overcome this?
Thank you for the question. I think it's very well said, and it's an observation that's been made over and over again certainly by King and others. I mean, throughout history. The problem of the white moderate, right? I mean, that's a kind of classic construct. I think the first way that I would maybe address it would be to, again, just trumpet the power of political organizing, face-to-face organizing. The work of Marshall Gans is someone to look at for this sort of work. Someone who's really illustrated the power of true political organizing and building horizontally empowered organizations. that get people to see that our fate truly is linked. And that's, I think, the second piece of it is this notion that there is, that there are benefits that white folks accrue is absolutely empirically true, right? When you think about the ways inequality works, the hoarding of wealth, et cetera. But what we can see, right, is that the long-term cost of this way of living, this political culture, this way of doing business, it is a decay and rot to everyone's civil rights, to everyone's health, right? Let's look at the pandemic, for example. During the pandemic, there was a period at the beginning where there was a lot of talk about, there's a great deal of discussion about racial inequities, the fact that it was a mostly Black and brown disease when it first came to the United States. And I'm sure there were many folk, in addition to being a poor person's disease, right? The sort of essential workers, the frontline workers who were forced to continue to work in face-to-face professions where they were exposed to the disease more frequently. And the effect of that is that privileged folk, and perhaps privileged white folk in particular, didn't take it seriously, didn't think it was their problem. But of course, the pandemic doesn't care, the virus itself doesn't care what your political beliefs are, what racial group you identify with. And eventually it spread and has fundamentally destroyed destroyed or at least shaken so many of the institutions that we took for granted. And I would submit that though, of course, the impacts of racism are disparate, there are ways in which that kind of public health analogy plays out when we think about racism. Would we not have a better public schooling system for everyone? Would education not be better if it weren't segregated? Would our healthcare system not be better if it weren't segregated? Would our labor market be more efficient and just, and therefore function better if it weren't segregated? Of course it would, right? So this notion that there's a benefit to white supremacy is true in the empirical wealth hoarding sense, and perhaps in the psychological sense, a feeling of superiority. But in the long term, right, you have to be able to see how impoverished a way of life this is for everyone, including white people. Jelani mentioned the price that white folk pay, right, when they align themselves. And that's because white supremacy prescribes it.
You know, there's a wonderful book by Heather McGhee called The Sum of Us, S-U-M of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone. That's a book that I would tell people they would need to read, whites and blacks, tell whites especially to read that book, because I think it would be a learning experience, very much the way that Michael is describing.
I would also harken back to Dr. King. When he was assassinated, he was in the process of enhancing the civil rights movement to create a movement for economic justice that embraced all races and most classes. And so I then returned to Bishop Barber, who continues that work and who does, in fact, try to speak out to a diversity of audiences in terms of race and classes. And Bishop Barber is a unique person, but he shows how you can bring people together and how you can teach those moderates that Dr. King wrote about from jail to understand some of the dimensions of what the Kerner Commission is all about.
We have another question. States, what are your thoughts on educating white Dems as to the threat that democracy faces and getting them to understand that centering whiteness in political discussion has failed them?
sounded different from the other question. It sounded like we would give you the same answer.
I mean, I think the only thing that I might add, I think you're right, Evelyn. It is a sort of a similar, I would have a similar kind of reaction. The only thing I might add is that achieving understanding is really just the first step. So even if we could truly get to a place where white folk truly understood the damage that was being done, first of all, I think there are some folk that do understand and truly don't care or are in pursuit of these aims, who are unabashedly pursuing a kind of nakedly white supremacist political order, right? So those folks may not be reachable, but then I think there may be another group who doesn't quite understand. But once you get to understanding, right, you have to move from understanding to action. You have to. And I think that's the piece where we need to use our imagination and again, realize the power of kind of tedious face-to-face organizing as a tool that we have to make change, right? Because understanding alone is not going to get it done.
Well, you know, so for the Black Lives Matter movement, especially after the murder of George Floyd, when we think of those huge, massive marches in cities all across the country, those weren't just Black people marching. There were a lot of white people in those marches. And in some places, there were more white people in those marches than even Black people. So I do think that's one thing that we need to understand. The question to me, though, Michael, would be, so when the marching stops, how do we get those same people working together? And that needs to be done. The book, I saw somebody ask the question. So the book I mentioned is by Heather McGhee, McGhee, and it's called The Sum of Us. The Sum of Us, US, and then colon, what racism costs everyone. That's the book.
All right, and our last question is more of a discussion question, but it says, please discuss the difference between bias and discrimination in the legal aspect. I'm concerned by bias seems to be the new PC or politically correct terminology.
Well, again, I would defer to my colleagues who've studied this in such great detail. Dr. Steele, his book, Whistling Vivaldi, Dr. Banaji on unconscious bias. You know, bias in and of itself is a natural psychological process. We actually need bias to function. It helps us navigate the world, right? We need to make kind of unconscious, quick decisions. So bias, the notion that we could kind of eradicate bias is not going to get us to anti-racism. Discrimination, right, is an active process that's about distribution of rights and resources. And thinking about racial prejudice as this kind of psychological bias, thinking about racism as a kind of psychological process, as a problem of bias only, doesn't really do justice to what's going on when it comes to discrimination. And we have the tools many times to deal with discrimination. Legal tools, despite the flaws in our legal system, they are actually quite effective in many cases in dealing with discrimination. Organizing, labor organizing, for example, actually quite effective in some respects. Now we can talk about how Black folk have been historically marginalized from the American labor movements, but those things are also effective for discrimination. But I think you're right, sometimes the turn toward bias and the emphasis on the psychological is sort of a trick to get us to direct our attention away from the institutional, the legal, and the practice of discrimination.
Can I just push back a teeny bit on that one, though? Because bias, and you did mention Claude Steele, who's done amazing work, Mazarine Menaji, who's done this amazing discussion of, unconscious bias. But the reason why I don't want to downplay it too much, Michael, is because it is bias. People need to be trained because it is the bias that criminalizes Black people. When you see a Black person running in a neighborhood and you automatically think that that person is a thief, that's a psychological bias that got Arbery killed. So I mean, those biases are real. The other, we had my own branch, the Martha's Vineyard branch. We had a conversation a while ago, and it really stuck in my mind. And the person who was talking, and I'm blanking on his name, forgive me if you're on the line, but he's a professor of philosophy at maybe Wesleyan. But one of the things he said is that walking in his neighborhood, he realized he had to have a dog and he needed a yellow lab. Now, because I have a yellow lab, Ginger, it would never have occurred to me that I needed Ginger to walk down the street so that if you couldn't have a pit bull or anything like that, but you had to have a dog that everybody thought was, a nice, friendly dog, because then people realize you must live in that neighborhood because you're walking. Now that is, with that, because he said he had been stopped many times by the police who just didn't realize that that was his neighborhood. This was what happened to poor Trayvon Martin. He was just automatically perceived to be not belonging there. So bias can get you killed. And so there've got to be ways that we can deal with teaching people, because some of us have biases that we don't want. We say things that we do need to be corrected on. And we learned that actually in the social justice workshops with Lisa Brock, that there are words we use, even as Black people.
Yeah,
we shouldn't use those words.
No question. And I think what I would say in agreement is to think that we're going to do it just with bias training. That's what I have an issue with, right? Yes, we need, no question, we need bias training. We need anti-racist training for every police officers and all of us, right? We could use it because there are things that are harmful that result from bias. Having said that, in and of itself, it's not going to address without the kind of complement of some sort of institutional guardrails, right, or accountability when bias goes awry.
Absolutely.
So we're at 8:47 p.m. It's been a really good discussion. I was thinking, Evelyn, maybe there are final comments that you all would like to give?
My comment is simply that it is a pleasure to be in this room with you. And we will have more social justice reading room experiences. So I look forward to seeing you again. Alan?
I would just like to say that president of the Mellon Foundation is a great poet, and she's going to be, Elizabeth is going to be talking with Tracy K. Smith soon. And so in respect to the president of the Mellon Foundation, I would just like to say that we need to embrace Langston Hughes and the dream deferred.
Absolutely. Michael?
I just want to thank you again for the invitation. Thanks to everybody working behind the scenes to make it happen. It doesn't happen by itself. And thanks to everybody who signed on to the call tonight. We need you. We need you to keep showing up. We're not here if not for you. So keep going, keep gathering together. We appreciate it.
Oh, I'd like to thank you all again. The panelists were just fabulous. The discussion was good. I want to thank our assistants here who looked at the many questions and culled them out and the thoughtful way you all answered the question. And of course, the Mellon Foundation for providing the grant and Howard University for bringing ASALH along on this really important Just Futures initiative. We'll be doing more of these reading rooms and we'll be doing more workshops. So we began our grant process with workshops and reading rooms. Please stay tuned to ASALH and look forward to seeing this again on ASALH TV in a few weeks. And so without any further ado, we're ending just a little early and I see lots of people are in the chat. I want to say thank you. And I see Marvin has joined in.
Sure.
Marvin, please.
Yes, I obviously want to thank Dr. Higginbotham, Dr. Jeffries, and Dr. Curtis for your participation. Yes, wonderful discussion tonight. Yes. Hope
Thank
to
you
have
so
you back soon.
Yes. Thank you, Marvin. Thank you again, everyone, for tuning in. Have a wonderful night.